Hello, everyone. My name is Angel Rivera. I'm a developer advocate for CircleCI. And today I have Mike Solomon from Unmock joining me in this webinar. And we're going to discuss squashing bugs and improving integration testing with CircleCI and Unmock today. Next slide, Mike.
Yeah.
So today's agenda is going to include introductions, really quick, brief intro into CircleCI and orbs by me. And then I'm going to turn it over to Mike to handle the rest, which is basically an unmocked overview, and then a nice demo between unmocked and CircleCI orbs. And then we'll follow it up with a Q&A session. So if for the Q&A, we do have, for those of you familiar with Zoom, at the bottom, there's a Q&A button of the Zoom client. Just click on that and ask your questions in there. And then when we're done, we'll allocate some time to go ahead and answer those for you. But please ask anything you want. We're open to all kinds of questions here. Yeah, so let's start with CircleCI. CircleCI is basically a platform for developers to build, test, and deploy their code using automation at scale. So what we built at CircleCI is a continuous integration, continuous delivery tool that developers can leverage to automate any of their testing, building of artifacts, uploading those artifacts to a bucket or to a target environment. You could even run infrastructure as code to build out infrastructures within your pipelines, right, to test that your applications are running. CircleCI has been around for quite some time. Next slide, please. And a little bit about more information about CircleCI as a company. I've been around since 2011. We've actually grown, I believe, to a little over 300 employees now since this slide was built. Yeah, we re-architected. One of the most important things and one of the coolest things, prior to me joining, the company had re-architected the platform and relaunched it in what I believe is 2017, and we launched it as a CircleCI 2.0, which is really cool. It started including the runtimes for you could run your applications within a containerized environment using Docker, and then we actually added orbs as well, which we'll be talking about a little later. And right now, currently, we actually run 1 million plus builds per day, right, on the platform, which is pretty impressive and awesome. So that means there's a lot of developers running their code through CI. So if you're not familiar with continuous integration, continuous delivery, this little diagram is pretty cool. It shows where CircleCI lives in your processes, right, in your pipelines and processes, or in your continuous integration processes. So on the right, obviously, right, we all store our code somewhere in some version control system, hopefully. And normally that'll be a GitHub, GitLab, or Bitbucket, whatever your VCS is. And then in the middle is CircleCI, right? And we're basically interacting with those code bases automatically. And we're monitoring for code changes. And when we detect those code changes, we run your builds, which are predefined by the project managers within the version control system. And off to the right, sorry, the creation part's the left. The right is the logistical piece, and that's where we do continuous delivery, and that's where we ship your code, right, to ship the code out to whatever environment you're targeting, such as Google Cloud or Amazon. Whatever it is that you're trying to deploy these applications to, you should be able to do so very easily with CircleCI. Next slide, please. Yeah, so, and like I said, we re-architected the platform in 2017. And then later on, we added this feature / open source project called orbs. Now, orbs are basically reusable packages of pipeline configuration. So the way CircleCI works is we have a file that lives in your projects or repos in your code base. And from there, you define, inside that file, you define your pipelines using YAML. Now, as we all know, YAML is a data structure, not a programming language. So it was really rough in the beginning for folks to kind of do some robust things within that YAML. But we realized that, and CircleCI had an answer for it, and orbs was the answer. So what orbs does is enables you to add a lot of flexibility, a lot of variability within your YAML. And that's due to the fact that the CircleCI has outfitted the backend platform to enable that. Next slide, please. Here's an example of a CircleCI orb. So if you look off to the left, you have three components there in the code, and the components are commands, executors, and jobs. So the commands are now parameterized whereas they weren't prior to orbs, right? And then that deals mainly with commands that are kind of kicked off in your pipelines. So those are more related to jobs. And executors, the runtime, which I mentioned earlier, we added the Docker or container runtime, right? Prior to that, we only had a straight up VM runtime, which we call with a machine executor. And then we also had Mac OS iOS runners. So now we've expanded that to include, like I said, Docker containers. You can run your code in the machine, which is the straight up VM runtime. You can run code in a Mac OS iOS environment. And now we also have added recently the Windows runtime as well. So we pretty much cover all the platforms, the popular platforms that are out there, which our users really like. And then finally, you have the orbs are composed of jobs, or different. Another component is jobs, and those are basically where you kind of define a bunch of commands, right? So that's a kind of an aggregator for your commands, and it allows you to kind of group them in a logical sense. Next slide. So with orbs, one of the side effects that we kind of encountered when we introduced the project to the users and this feature to the users is a lot of common CircleCI users have common uses with other companies, right? So for instance, Unmock. If you're an Unmock user and you're a CircleCI user, you can leverage using Unmock within your CircleCI pipelines. So now with orbs, it's much easier to do. Before, you'd have to write a ton of YAML to get that functionality. But since we've created orbs and created these partnerships with other companies, our partners are now creating orbs, right, for their products and then hosting them within the CircleCI registry, which adds a really, really nice ease of use kind of functionality and feature to CircleCI and the partners like Unmock. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is a wrap for me. We'll post this. We're going to post this video or this webinar on YouTube. So I know this is a little hard to read, but if you want to grab a screenshot, you can go ahead and do that. Otherwise, again, we'll add these links to the YouTube webinar if you come back to it later on. All right, so now I'd like to turn it over to Mike for his portion of the presentation. And I'm really excited to hear what he has to say. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much to Angel and to the whole entire team for hosting the webinar. I got to know CircleCI at a physical meetup in Seattle maybe about a year ago. Was very impressed with what the company's doing, and since then internally we're built on CircleCI. So the way that we got to know them with a user, even before building an orb, which made it quite easy to author the orb because, as Angel mentioned, it's authored using a lot of the same syntax that people are familiar with. So one thing that I would plug for all of you attending this is, in addition to discovering Unmock and what we do, all of you guys can author your own orbs as well on CircleCI. And you would be surprised, or actually there's no surprise because it's all on GitHub and open source. You can go and see how small the Unmock orbs are at the end of the day. And most of that is because the CircleCI tooling is really robust. So for example, CircleCI stores artifacts, and our orb simply tells CircleCI where to find the artifact. So it'll simplify stuff for you a little bit because it's you don't have to go find the artifact yourself in the file system. But at the end of the day, it's already built on top of a lot of powerful stuff that's already in CircleCI. So we're very appreciative for that, and continue to be a big fan of the project, both internally and externally. So what I'd like to do now is present this. So I put bad ways to do integration testing. We're going to start with that. I see that there's already a couple questions in the QA. I'm not sure, but I designed the presentation so that you guys can feel free to ask something at any time, especially because at a certain point we're going to dive into CircleCI and the code, and we're going to be looking at a lot of builds. So even if you have a question about CircleCI itself, luckily we have an expert that can answer it from the company, but I'm happy to answer too. And I'll show both dashboards, the new one and the old one, just because they're both interesting, and I'll kind of flip between the two. So without further ado, bad ways to do integration testing. A lot of people don't do integration testing, and that's fine. Not doing integration testing at all can be an improvement even over bad ways to do integration testing. So there's no worry at all if you're attending this webinar and are not doing integration testing or testing and have not heard about it. So we're assuming that there's no knowledge at all of what the process is. So what I'll define now for you guys is integration testing. So it's testing how your piece of software integrates with some other service that for whatever reason you can't encapsulate in your build. So if you're building something, let's say a Flask server in Python or an Express server in JavaScript, it might need to interact with other microservices downstream or upstream, and in both cases you want to test out that integration somehow. So that's integration testing. And as microservice patterns become more and more common, and both in producing and consuming them, there's more and more integrations and more things outsourced to other companies, the proof being CircleCI amongst others. Usually people had to do their own CI, and now thankfully companies exist like CircleCI that can propose those services. But what that means is that there's more integrations, and sometimes integrations tend to be fragile. So when things are fragile, we test them, not only to make sure they work, but to describe them as a spec for other people, so that when they're reading through the code base, if you onboard somebody for the first time, they can see how they're supposed to work. So tests and all tests, including integration tests, are both verification, not documentation. But that's just integration and testing in general. And what I promised is to talk about bad ways to do it. So without further ado, let's take a look at that. So bad option one is doing nothing, which I talked about before. But what's even worse is doing something and then doing nothing. So what I've seen a lot of teams do is get a lot of enthusiasm around writing tests. And we'll go in kind of a test binge, like have a bunch of code, then write a bunch of tests. And the test will eventually pass, but because there's not like a culture of testing, eventually the tests don't pass because of the changes, which doesn't necessarily mean that the code's broken. It can just mean that the code's evolving and the tests are not evolving in parallel. And then what you start doing is, because it's too bothersome to work on the tests, or you feel it is, you'll disable them. And I've seen code bases that are littered with like a disabled test, which shows the intention of the author at the time, but it doesn't necessarily show why it's disabled or like what's the blocker for it to be enabled, or should it just be deleted altogether. So that's bad option one, is disabling all your tests. Bad option two, which I strongly advise against, is using the real APIs from your CI pipeline. So if you guys want to do API call from CircleCI, it's totally fine. There's no problem. You can call any API you want from CircleCI. You can embed any credential you want in CircleCI. There's an environmental variable setting, and you can set environment variables. That's not part of this presentation, but I'll show you guys what that looks like a little bit later on. But the thing is that if you have real production calls from your CircleCI environment, even though the CircleCI is super secure and running HTTPS and the containers themselves are secure, there's still lots of undesirable side effects that you can produce by using the real API. So for example, one story that I love to tell, it's the one in the middle that I call I Want You Back. So a company accidentally embedded a Twilio API key in their CI environment. In this case, it wasn't CircleCI, but another CI provider, sending a text message tens of times a day to a person in Kansas saying, I want you back, with a little heart. And that's like yeah, you can see angels laughing in the background. It's nice for that person in Kansas, because who doesn't want to be wanted back, right? But it's not particularly nice for the company. So that was using Twilio, which again, in the bad old days, you had to do all that stuff yourself. But thankfully, Twilio exists, and they can take care of our sending text messages. But what that means is that you don't necessarily have access to Twilio's production logs, or if you do, then you're an awesome hacker, but you probably shouldn't. So you don't you're not privy to some of the bugs that might be induced by working with an external service. So that's one thing that could go wrong. Another thing that I've seen, and this is something that our company was part of, unfortunately, the too much Swagger one. So there's an internal project that's canned because a team's Swagger spec and an API implementation grow apart. So what Swagger is it's a way to document APIs. The most recent version is called Open API. I think it's 3.0.2. And it's a fantastic way to document APIs. But what can happen is that if you're testing only on the internal or only on the production APIs and not at all giving any love to the spec, then the production APIs can evolve organically and the spec will just kind of live the way that it was originally born. And if there's no way to take a diff between them and compare the two of them, because you're only interacting with production APIs, then there could be diff between the spec and the actual APIs, and that results in an untenable situation where nobody knows what the right ones are. So these are the bad options when you use a production API for testing in general, but especially from your CI pipeline. Bad option 3 is testing your mocking library. So here it's written in a Pythonic way, but it could apply to any bit of code. A lot of times if you're using a mocking library, like the ones that come with PyTest, or if you're using Unmock, which that's what it is, a mocking library, or something like Knock or Poly.js, which are other mocking libraries. I've seen a lot of tests that fall into the pattern of what I call garbage in, garbage out. So you'll serve some type of fixture or mock to the test, and then assert that you got that fixture back. So the test will pass, but all you've done is asserted that your mocking library works, which the maintainers of the library might be into, but it doesn't necessarily help you describe how your code and how your business logic should execute. So another thing I call this is testing the happy path, because it tests that like the code or mocks move through your system. But it's really hard sometimes, and it's okay that it's hard to figure out ways to test the integration itself, meaning the dynamism of how your code interacts with the integration, as opposed to just asserting that like the integration served some information back to you, like a JSON response. So that's bad option 3. And the last bad option, which I see happening like a lot, is reverse engineering another API. And usually this creeps in. So a typical thing will be like somebody needs to test out an integration with Facebook. So they'll mock like a couple of responses from Facebook, but then because it's transactional in some way, meaning it's based on like 2 or 3 interactions with Facebook, like if it's some type of authentication or like looking up some type of details about users that are integrated with Facebook, it could be several transactions, and all of those might have some logic. So then you start writing a little bit of logic all in your test file, the way that Facebook works, and then pretty soon you've written a mini version of Facebook within your test suite. And you've kind of accidentally reverse engineered Facebook. Of course, you could then go and sell your reverse engineered version and make a lot of money with a competitor Facebook, but it's not necessarily like your business plan to reverse engineer a version of Facebook. So this cartoon encapsulates it well. I'll read it out for you guys. So that's the ugliest mess of code I've ever seen. What on earth are you working on? It's nothing weird, I swear. It just looks bad because it's a spreadsheet formula, which assembles a Haskell function for parsing HTML. So you get the idea that like good intentions of doing something small could balloon to something unmaintainable. And one thing that one of my favorite testing gurus, whose name is Yoni Goldberg, says all the time is that test should be the simplest part of your code, the most elegant, enjoyable part to read. They should have as little logic as possible, because when somebody starts in the company the first day, ideally the first thing that they'll read is the test, because the tests are the first reader of your code. And as Angel mentioned, on CircleCI, so of these 1 million projects, many of them have tests. So the tests are the things that are interacting with your code, sometimes even more than your user base, if you're running like hundreds of builds per day on CircleCI for certain endpoints. A lot of times it's the opposite, but still that's something to keep in mind. The tests are like mini users that are running through your code. So those are all bad options. But if I were only here to talk about bad options, it would be a pretty depressing webinar. That said, I'm in Finland right now, and it's one of the darkest times in the year. So there's much cause for melancholy, but there is light at the end of the tunnel, even if there's none in my country. And that is good option 1, using the Unmock CircleCI orb. So what we're going to do for the remainder of the time that we have together before the questions is that I'm going to show 2 features of the Unmock orb. And as I mentioned, they're quite minimal. Like I'm flattered and happy that we're a CircleCI partner, but when you look at some of the other orbs on CircleCI, like the codecov orb, for example, it's massive. It's very long. Like I said, ours is quite short. So the orb, we leverage already the power of CircleCI to facilitate using Unmock, but a lot of what I'm talking about is not showing off the orb as much as it's showing off like how nicely CircleCI makes building and running tests. So Unmock orb exists in 2 flavors. I'll show both of them, and then I'll show you some demo places that you can see how it works. So flavor 1, sorry, it's my browser looks like it. Sorry, I need to reload the page. This is the demo effect. Like, all right. Yeah, one thing I'll do. Okay, it looks like that one worked, and it's these 2 that are.
We're not seeing anything, Mike.
Yeah. Let me tell you what. Let me X out of this really quickly. I'm going to go to the raw presentation because they are here. So I think it's a Google bug, and I apologize that you see like it's not as nice to look at this.
Oh yeah, so it's not. Can you try to play again, maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've never seen that bug before. That when you go into play mode.
Now go to the. There you go.
Yeah, maybe they're not running their builds on CircleCI, so they didn't catch.
They're definitely not, right? Like it's Google. All right, that's cool, man. Just jump into the how you had it before. It's fine.
Yeah, sorry about that. It's unaesthetic, but
all good. Technical difficulties.
Yes, content rules. So the content here, we'll flip back to it after this. So use case 1, store your Unmock artifacts on CircleCI. So the way that works in the orb is that you could use an Unmock reporter, and we'll look at the orb page in a little bit. It's here, and you can just check us out in the registry. So it's Unmock upload command, but the result is that when you're running upload Unmock, if you're using the Unmock reporter, it will show all of the fake data that has been generated. So actually, let me. I haven't actually talked about how Unmock works yet because I've been pretty enthusiastic about talking about the orb. We'll get there in a second. But Unmock, the succinct way to put it is that it generates buckets loads of fake data and kind of tries to break your API with the fake data in the testing process in the most like cruel ways. And usually you find lots of fun bugs. So that's what we do. Some people call it property-based testing. Others call it fuzzing. There's a difference between those 2, and there's like whole wars in the functional programming community about what that difference is. But I just call it spanning massive amounts of real-looking fake data and trying to break your stuff. That's what we do. So, and occasionally we charge people money for it, but all of this stuff is open source. So that's use case 1 is to store the artifacts. Actually, let me even click on one to make it a little bit bigger, just so you can see what that's like. So this is one of the output results that shows the fake data that was created. The topology of the fake data changes depending on the specs you create, and we'll get into how to do that. But it shows all the fake data that was thrown at your system. And it's just getting this report. It used to be the case that this type of stuff wasn't hosted on CircleCI. I don't know when they added the artifacts feature, but we used to self-host it until we realized that CircleCI did, and then we were like, get rid of the self-hosting and just use CircleCI. So that's what we do. So those artifacts are hostable on CircleCI, and it will, in addition to doing that, it'll leave a GitHub comment in your GitHub repository in the pull request itself, where you can just click on it and see the artifact, just like codecov. So if you guys use the codecov plugin, this is no different, and we were very inspired by them. Except it's showing a different thing. It's showing the fake data that was used to test out your API, and then even more importantly, like when it passes, that's great. But if you can find a bug because the right cocktail of fake data caused your app to crash, that's like way better that the fake version does it than a real user does. So that's one. 2, it's running an Unmock server on CircleCI. So if you're developing some type of API or microservice, so like using Node or Flask or Spring, doesn't matter. We can boot up a server that serves the fake responses. And in this case, it's a little bit trickier to get up and going because you'll have to point your test to a proxy running on CircleCI. A lot of times that's doable just by overriding an environment variable. So for example, there's a node proxy variable that you can use to have a reverse proxy intercept your stuff. There's one in Spring Boot as well. Python's a little less friendly, but Flask has a way to do that. So depending on what you guys are running in CircleCI, what type of job is being executed, there's different ways to point to, instead of hitting the internet, hit my local proxy. But then once you do that, you can use case 2, which is that local proxy is an unmock server that's serving the fake results. So what I'm going to show you in the rest of the demo is how to build in-code mock. So it's not going to be unmock server. It'll be a slightly different way. And the reason you'll see in a little bit why I present it that way, but I show this just to say that at the end of that demo, if you decide to run a server, instead you could run unmock server on CircleCI. And an example of how to do that, again, go into the org registry. You check out, sorry, I'll make this a little bigger because if you're watching on your phones, it's suboptimal. So you check out the most recent, here the bleeding edge is unmock volatile. You could also use 0.0.14 and it's just as fine. So the steps are that you call unmock start, and then you set certain variables. So for example, you want success code to be 200 when you run your APIs, or 400 or whatever. And what this will do is it will start a proxy server that your actual code will interact with to do all the mocking. And then you can run, so in this case it's Go, but you could run like Python test, JavaScript test, whatever. And instead of interacting with the real production APIs, it'll interact with the fake version of them on your CircleCI server. So that's use case 2 is unmock start, unmock set. But it's brought in with the same orb. So you bring it in with unmock. So that's the orb. The whole orb is open source, and I'll show it to you just because we have time. So let's see where it's actually not in this repo. Yeah, orb. Sorry. So a lot of it is just setting the right environmental variables for the proxy. And then if I go, for example, to so this is how orb is authored. So if it's upload, it finds the artifacts. And then most of it is echoing. And it just uses curl to upload an artifact somewhere. So it's like a bash job. And the whole entire orb itself is less than 300 lines of YAML, which is one of the shorter, I think, I haven't looked at all the CircleCI orbs, but it's pretty short. So those are the only 2 things that are in it. That said, after I do the presentation, I would love a little bit of feedback if people think that other things in the orb are useful, but those are the 2 things. So to summarize, what the orb can do is 1, store your unmock artifacts in CircleCI, and 2, boot up a server to serve fake data on CircleCI. And both of those are accomplishable through the unmock orb. That sounds a bit abstract because we haven't tried out unmock yet, which we're going to do presently. So the rest of the time, we're going to be spending a lot of time in failing tests. Like I love when things fail. It's kind of boring when they succeed. So I've set up this repo on CircleCI called unmock.ts that has tons of failure. We're going to get it green, so don't worry about it, but there's lots of stuff failing. So the rest of the presentation, we're going to spend a lot of time in code, a lot of time in CircleCI, and we're going to make tests pass using unmock. And then for those of you who aren't doing testing yet on CircleCI, I would strongly recommend that you do. It's pretty awesome, and this will, even if you think that unmock sucks and you don't want to use it, like run your tests on CircleCI, and you can see how easy it is to do. And the rest of the chat is going to be about that. So what we're going to do is use unmock to write and run some tests. So this is the demo, and the demo is going to use this idea called koans, which is this Zen Buddhist practice. So I'll read it to you guys. It's also on Wikipedia. I'm sorry, I can go back to presentation mode here. Sorry, I see some questions coming in already. I don't know if, well, maybe Angel can decide which ones are appropriate to pose now and which ones can go.
Yeah, we'll just answer them all after. Go ahead, continue.
Okay, that's cool. So, and about how much time should I give for that, just to make sure?
5 minutes should do.
For questions. Okay, so like 7:55. Sorry, 8:55 finish time, or something 55 wherever in the world.
I'll give you the wrap signal.
Okay, cool. So yeah, we'll make it through most now. So a koan is a story, dialogue, question, or statement, which is used in Zen practice to provoke great doubt. and test the student's progress in Zen practice. So I can't think of anything that provokes more doubt than a build failing. It like is a crushing emotion. So it feels like a sensible thing to do to present the material. So we're going to present 9 koans, all of which are failing, and we're going to make them succeed locally, and then we're going to make them succeed on CircleCI. And all but the first, the success will be linked to Unmock. So the goal for each one is to describe a concept in testing, implement it in Unmock, push to CircleCI, and watch CircleCI awesomeness as the build progressively gets closer and closer to passing. So Koan 1, what I just want to talk about very basically is a unit test. So if you've never written a unit test before, no worries. So they're small, easy to read, expressive bits of code that describe and verify how, I should have put it's how your code base is supposed to behave. So that's my definition of a unit test. There's lots of other ones out there. There's also flame wars about what unit tests are and aren't, and I don't want to I don't want to go there. But what I will say is that so here we're in TypeScript land. So if you guys are not TypeScript developers, I'll try to be really pedagogical about it. But it's true that there is a language barrier, of course, if you've never seen TypeScript before. But what I really hope you can retain is the concept. And not necessarily the implementation. So this is a unit test. It's written using a test framework in the JavaScript community called Jest, which also works in TypeScript. And what we're going to do is split a list of users into 2 separate lists, ones that are admins and ones that are not admins. So here we represent if somebody's an admin is admin true, and if they're not an admin, is admin false. So what we would like to test, the function under test is our function called split users. Usually this would be in a separate file, but here it's in the test file. And tests work a lot with expectations or assertions. So here we're going to assert that the list of admins is equal to this, which is the same as this, and the list of not admins is equal to this, which is the same as this. So it's a Git project. I will actually let me show you guys right now the name of the repo. I went over it briefly, but it's github.com/unmock/unmocktsclone. So don't hesitate to clone it right now, or rather, please, if you're following, clone it right now. Otherwise, it's super boring to listen to my voice just for 20 minutes without typing some code. So clone it, and even if you're not a TypeScript person, you could follow along with what I'm doing in the webinar to get it going. So if you're cloning it for the first time, the way to just install stuff in it is running yarn. If you don't have yarn installed, you could do npm install yarn global, and if you don't have npm installed, you have to install node, which might be a little long for these purposes, but that's how to get yarn in your computer. And then what we're going to do is run the test. So each test here is addressed as test 1, 2, 3, and then all of them can be run just test. So I'm going to run the first test by doing yarn test 1, this test that I was just talking about. And it's going to fail because that's what koans are all about, provoking great doubt. So we are expecting that our users are going to be split into 2 camps. However, the test is failing. Why? Because the second one, the not admin list, instead of getting not admin, or an admin being false, which is what we're expecting, we're actually getting the admin. So why are we getting an admin in our not admin list? Well, if we look at the function, well, there's several reasons. One, there could be a bug in our test, but in this case, there's a bug in our function. So if we look at the function split users, and actually, let me see what branch we're on. I think we're on the master branch. Let's check out CircleCI branch. And we'll push it. So you guys, if you're on GitHub, you can make your own fork or just download the CircleCI branches we're going through it. So we see that this function that's splitting into admins and not admins, it's the same thing for admins and not admins. It's kind of like there's an episode of The Simpsons where they show that like Duff and Duff Light are drawn from the same bat, and then it's a whole scandal of like, you know, Springfield like goes on fire or something. So same thing here, that admins and not admins are uses the same function. So to fix it, we want to, for not admin, we want to see that the user is not an admin. And in JavaScript land, we do not with a exclamation point. In Python land, you could use other conventions like the word not. But now, if I run the test, it will pass. So there we have one test that's passed. And now I can put fixes logic glitch. And when I push, sorry, not master, origin, CircleCI, automatically, this build will start running on CircleCI. And to show that I'm truthful, we'll go here. We can see a bunch of builds that have already run. Should reload. And there you go. We have our CircleCI branch that's running. It will fail because all the tests in it have not been fixed yet. But we'll see that at least the first test passes. So here on the dry run that I did, because I did address reversal beforehand, we see that all of the tests, so 9 out of 9 fail. And if I'm true to my word, then now only 8 out of 9 should fail. So we're going to look at the way that CircleCI works when it's running tests. Now it's doing a bunch of stuff that's not running tests, but it will run them soon. CircleCI is blazingly fast, so it's way faster than my laptop. It's just yeah, usually when it gets to this part, it's quite fast. So we'll see that the same flow. So the test has passed here as well in CircleCI, and we have the unmock org enabled there. So there you go. So that's just a test. Again, we're not using unmock. We're just showing how a unit test works. So it's important, like, to see like that. That's what testing code can be, amongst other things. So now we're going to bring in unmock. So before we were just testing a function that got a list of users. However, it's quite rare that if you have a production API, you would store all of your users in memory on a server. Or that would be like coding Russian roulette, to like have one production API, no database, and only store all of your users in memory. I dare anybody to create a unicorn company that has one server that has like 3-year uptime and stores all of their data in memory. I would love to see that. But if you don't, then you have to store it somewhere, and generally you're going to fetch it with an API. So this function does the same exact thing that we saw before. Splits users, except it's going to await an API. So we're going to call it myservice.io, or, you know, to honor CircleCI, let's call it api.circleci-rocks.io/users, because we're on the CircleCI branch. So we'll do that. And what we're going to do is create a spec of how that works. So this is similar to a lot of other mocking platforms. So Unmock takes its inspiration from one called Knock, which is a really popular Node.js framework. To be fair, and full disclosure, is way more popular than ours. So like, even if you don't want to work with Unmock, check out Knock. It's pretty awesome, but we think Unmock is like 1 order of magnitude more awesome. But that said, Knock is the competition. I'm a Knock user myself, and helped build Unmock to address some flaws that I saw with it, but Knock does still kick serious butt. So that's so we define that when we call the user's endpoint, we're going to reply, with the same thing that we replied with before, the same exact array. So we're going to run the test, and as promised, it's going to fail. And the reason it'll fail is because we forgot to turn unmock on. So unmock is super invasive, meaning that here, because we didn't turn it on, it actually called a website called api.circleci-rocks.io, which, to be fair, might actually exist. I could ask Angel if you guys own CircleCI Rocks, and if I just accidentally spammed your API. I'm pretty sure that's not the case, but it actually tried to make a network call to the service, and that's like a bad idea for me to do. So what you got to do is turn unmock on, and what it will do is intercept that call and serve back something according to the spec. So in this case, reply with this array, which is the same array that we saw before. So now we're just going to turn unmock on in our test file, and when we run the same test again, it'll pass, git commit a message, test passes, git push u origin CircleCI, and we'll see. I won't always flip back to CircleCI, but just trust me that it's running there and living there. We'll flip back from time to time. So now it passed. So Koan 1 was a unit test. Sorry, I have slides about all these things. They're only recently added, so I forgot they exist, but they exist. So Koan 2, a mock. So mocks or fixtures are copies of the outputs of one program used for testing another program. So copy it, record it however you want, and there you go. So this is the important bit, and like this is how Unmock is trying to make a dent in the world. So it's kind of why we exist as a project, and why it's very important to me. I spend a lot of time thinking about these things, probably an unhealthy amount of time, but I really hope that it's a vision that other people share and get behind and root for. So it's property-based testing. So property-based testing describes the properties that software should have. So phrases like for all and there exists at least one are commonly used in property-based testing. So for example, for all calls to a user's endpoint, it should return an array of users. So why do I think property-based testing is important? Because it describes the properties of your software as opposed to describing any one instance. So going back to the test that I wrote, we don't really know what the properties are of users. Like, is it that the properties of a user's array is an array with 2 entries? Probably not. Like, it's probably an array of n entries where n is between 0 and like some pagination like 10 or something like that. But it's probably not 2. But we don't know. It could be that it's 2 entries, and we don't know what the property of the API is. Even more problematically, we don't know if the property of a user is that it has only these 2 fields. Does it have other fields sometimes? Is it sometimes lacking these fields? Is it a property of the API that always returns 200? I don't know of any API that always returns 200. So I would be amazed if this API had the property that it only ever returns correct results. But like, so there you go. Like, so here, we're not really documenting the properties of the API. We're just documenting its behavior. And that can work in a pinch, but I think that property testing is really important. However, it's until now quite hard to do. So what we wanted to do is lower the barrier to property testing with Unmock. And we do that here. So this test is called use variable input. And now we have the same exact test. I'm going to flip between the two. So here, instead of ID being 1, we put ID is u.number. So I import this thing called u, and I'm saying ID should be a number, right? So same exact test is test 3. I'm going to run it, and we're missing the is admin field. So it's going to fail, and I'm going to add it. So is admin u.boolean. So if you remember from before, is admin here, we had true and false. And here, we're going to put u.boolean. So it's going to be the bool, and we'll see it passes. And what Unmock is going to do, when I said like we excel at generating massive amounts of fake data, this is going to generate an array between 0 and n users, where n is something ridiculously big, and then fill it all with a mandatory ID and a mandatory boolean that could be true or false. So if there's a bug in your code that, like, let's say if admin's over with a value over 10, like if there's somebody that has an ID over 10 that is an admin that triggers a bug, random generation is a faster way to get there than like manually creating all the test cases, and you'll know it this way. So randomly generating results is pretty important. And the interesting bit, going down to the test, is not only does it create a more robust test suite, but it also creates better to read tests. So here, in the previous test, I was testing that the admin list equaled this rote data, but that's not really what I want to onboard somebody. When I'm onboarding somebody into my company, I don't want to like sit down with them and say like, hey, this rote data is what we're expecting from the API. I want to tell her, him the behavior. So here, I'm going to say for each admin, for each user that's an admin, we expect that is admin to be true. For each user that's not an admin, we expect is admin to be false. So here in my test, I'm hard coding nothing. I'm talking about the behavior that I want to see from the API. And this is the change that we want to bring out to the world. And instead of making assertions about hard-coded values, you're making assertions about behavior. I think that a lot more code would be a lot easier to read and have a lot less bugs if we spent more time talking about how it's supposed to behave. So that's the important bit. That said, there still is 6 minutes in the webinar before questions. So there is important stuff too, but this is the most important. And there will be like slightly less important stuff in here now. So the next thing I'd like to address, and I'll push the CircleCI in a second so you can see it in action, is a runner. So runners take a piece of test code and run it, sometimes multiple times with different configurations. So the yin to the yang of fake data in Unmock is a runner. So you wrap all of the code in Unmock in a runner, and it will run the code. The default is 20 times, but we've done stress testing with up to 500, and it's not a noticeable slowdown for simple unit tests. So the advantage of a runner is that if you only generate random data once, it will like be one test case, but that doesn't necessarily help you out. What really helps out is to have a runner, and in parallel, Unmock has something called a shrinker. That kind of, the way to think about a runner is that it will run a test case a lot of times, like 100. And a shrinker, you can imagine like if you're playing a video game and zooming in on like hotspots in the video game where you need to do something, a shrinker will be the same way. It will find bugs in your code, and as soon as it finds a bug, it will try to shrink down to like the minimum viable use case that will provoke your bug. So that it doesn't just say like, hey, your code's broken, but it says, hey, whenever you have an ID over 10, they'll break your code. So here, we have a runner in our test, and the way that we do it is we just wrap our function in something called runner, which is imported from Unmock runner, and we see that we have a bug. So the interesting bit is that if we take away the runner, so we have an expectation about a user's age that provokes a bug. I'm going to take away the runner for now, so just zap, runner's gone, because it's just a wrapper. So instead of running 20 times, it'll run 1 time now. And we're going to see something crazy and unfortunate. The test is going to pass. Why did the test pass? Because it didn't run 20 times. So the configuration of mock data that the test generated here actually passed, even though there's a bug in the code. So by having a runner, we automatically run the code multiple times and can provoke bugs in our code. So if you're somebody that doesn't like discovering bugs in your code, the runner is probably a bad idea. If you're like emotionally fragile in that way, I know I am, but I've gotten over it. And the runner has shown me some really stupid stuff that I did here in my coding life. And here, the runner is that age, we've defined that age could be any of integer or null. And it turns out that in Node, null can be compared to integers. Who knew, right? Ah, crap. So like,
well, that's JavaScript, right?
Sorry, yeah, in JavaScript, yeah, not just Node. Sorry, I'm not hating on.
Right.
I'll hate on JavaScript. Yeah, that won't work. But yeah, you could do all sorts of stuff with null. That's the thing, is that back in the day, like people thought that like doing crazy stuff with null was a good idea. But even the inventor of null has called it the $1 billion mistake. So you know the jury is still out on if null is a good idea or not. But we're stuck with it. So here in the test, if age can be null, then we want to rule out null values. So user.age is not equal to null. I'll just do like a couple non-null checks. There's other ways to do it in TypeScript too. And user.age equals null. So here I've like added null checks to my code. I know that was pretty fast, so I'm sorry that the addition was fast, but I'm just keeping an eye on time. So now we've done the checks, and that means that when the runner runs, the code passes. I'll put yay, git push u origin CircleCI, and we can see it building on CircleCI. So we don't have that much time, so I'm just going to fly over the other 2 concepts that in Unmock you could spy on certain results and make assertions that whatever the generated code is was mapped in the right way. So for example, if you're generating an object, like here's an object of integers and first names, we could spy on the response and assert that our user's object matches the spied response. So it's a way to spy on the way that API is behaving, and then ask the question, did we treat that behavior correctly upstream? So if your code is like, let's say that your API returns an object and your code adds 4 fields to the object. One thing you could do is strip away those 4 fields and say, is what we have equal to what the API returned? And the way to know that is by looking at what's called the spy. The spies, and then just the last thing I'll say about Unmock before I flip back to CircleCI, because I don't want to steal CircleCI's thunder, so I will show you the stuff is passing, is that in Unmock, you can initialize it to arbitrary states. So for example, here, we say that it could be 200, 401, or 404, could be all the possible outcomes, but I could initialize it to, for example, without the codes 400 or 401, or without the codes 401 or 404. And to do that, without code is actually a function. So unmock, there's a lot of passing functions to functions, which is called functional programming. I myself am a Hascaller by nature, so I forced myself to use JavaScript at a certain point. But TypeScript is pretty awesome. I'm not gonna lie. I could do a lot of stuff. Like, don't tell Haskell people this, but TypeScript can go pound for pound with Haskell and a lot of cool things. You could also set the response body, so you could set the code and the response body. So unmock doesn't just allow you, doesn't just say generate random anything. You could also zoom in and kind of control the randomness in unmock. So as promised, I will flip back to CircleCI just to show you that all this stuff is alive and kicking on CircleCI when you're running the test. So even though I'm here to talk about unmock orb, which I've shown it to you, I kind of want to hijack the presentation just for the last 30 seconds to say that, like, run tests on CircleCI. We were talking about this before with Angel, but like, that's a great way. A lot of people only build stuff on CircleCI, but like, the unmock orb is kind of only half the story, and the other half is like, if you're running tests on CircleCI, it's a great way to check out different failure cases of your code and learn what they are. So we have caught a lot of bugs, and Mishkin, I'm brave enough to say that we have our fair share of bugs too, and we've caught a lot of them using unmock. So if you can take the first step of admitting that you have bugs, then the second step is catching them, and I think this could be a useful tool in that, and I hope that you're catching them on CircleCI. So that's all I got to say. I will maybe flip back to the presentation just so you can see the bit.ly link, sorry, not bit.ly, but the GitHub link I put for it. And this is recorded as well. And now I'll turn it over to the question.
Yeah, thanks for that in-depth demo, Mike. It's pretty. I learned a few things, and afterwards I'm going to pick your brain a little bit about some of the stuff. Definitely like what I saw with Unmocked, and I agree. A lot of folks that, especially in our customer base, generally are light in the tests and heavy on the deployment side, which yeah, I would like to see a huge improvement on that. So yeah, we only have a few minutes left, and I think we're down to a few questions here that were asked. So I'll just go ahead and address those real quick. So will the recording be available online later? Yes, the recording will be online at least at the YouTube channel for CircleCI. I posted a link in the chat channel, so for folks who are interested, just go to the CircleCI YouTube channel, and this will be up there probably later this week at some point. The next question was regarding configuration as code. There's an issue with security, especially if your code is open source. What systems does CircleCI offer to mitigate risk? Things like leaking security, deploying malicious code, running miners in CI, aggregating high bills. So there's a couple ways that we at CircleCI kind of to answer some of those scenarios. Number one, we take security really, really seriously, obviously. And the reason is that we're running other people's code, right? So we're accessing a very sensitive information, and we're taking action on it, right? So again, we're very sensitive to people's code and data, and we last a little over a year now, we were authorized on FedRAMP, which is a U.S. federal government initiative where it's for procurement. So in the federal government, if you want to use software, it has to be vetted by federal government. And so since we're on FedRAMP, we're the only CI/CD platform that's available for purchase by federal agencies, like legit. So that means, you know, we have to go through rigorous security screenings and then make sure that our organization is running certain protocols that are accepted, like SOC 2, GDPR, all that good stuff. So number one, we're all about security. It's a top priority. Number two, addressing some of the systems that we have is obviously we're hosting data encrypted at rest and in flight. So end to end, the information being stored on our systems is encrypted, and also when we're transmitting. And one of the other ways, leaking secrets, obviously, right? If you're only as secure as the user, or not only as secure, but the user has a part to play in the security. So if you're posting keys up into your open source projects, then obviously you're going to leak secrets. That's outside of Circle. And the other piece to that is to address the miners in CircleCI. That happens often, usually in our freemium tier, where people are the bad actors are leveraging our generosity in trying to mine Bitcoin. We have mechanisms on the back end to detect that, right? So we know what the patterns are, and we cut that stuff off as soon as possible to obviously avoid us incurring costs and our customers, as well. So hopefully that answers that. And the next question I have here is, what's the best resource to get started creating CircleCI orbs? Yeah, that's a great question. We do have, if you go to our documentation, I'll just refer you to CircleCI orbs. And in there's tons of information. It's part of those links that I showed earlier. So if you go there, you can do that. And yeah, that's all of the questions I have for today. If there's anything else, I think this is the conclusion of it all. Mike, you want to add anything else?
No, thanks a lot. Thanks to CircleCI. And just maybe I'll say that Unmock is open source. So if you're interested in contributing, or if there's any issues, feel free to leave a GitHub issue, and we're more than happy to take it.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mike. And to all of you out there, thanks for joining in. And we'll be posting this to YouTube, as I said earlier. Thanks a lot.